Maryland began life as a province, as a haven for Catholics and the personal property of a baron. It is now the country's richest state with the highest median household income in the U.S. as of 2023. To see how that happened, join me for this brief look at the history and politics of Maryland. Anthropologists estimate that Maryland's first inhabitants came to the area around the end of the last ice age, some 11,000 years ago. They were hunter-gatherers known as Paleo-Indians, whose lifestyle slowly changed with the adoption of new food sources like oysters by 1500 BCE and technology like pottery around 1000 BCE, as well as bow and arrow around 800 AD. There was also agriculture, of course, which was based around the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash. This would all culminate into the creation of permanent villages formed by longhouses around 1000 AD. By the time Europeans began settling the area in the 17th century, there was a mix of Algonquian and Iroquoian people, divided into a number of groups with various territories, like the Susquehannocks, Lenape, Massawamek, Choptank, Piscataway, Nanticoke, among others. It is believed that the first Europeans to encounter the future state of Maryland were the men on John Cabot's expedition in 1498, when they sailed along the eastern shore of present-day Worcester County. Cabot was sailing under the British flag and soon would be joined by other European powers, including the French with Giovanni Verrazzano in 1524 and the Spanish in the 1560s. Iberian knowledge of the area was first published in a Diego Gutierrez map in 1562, the first outline of the Chesapeake Bay, what he called the Bahía de Santa Maria. Pedro Menéndez de Áviles, the governor of Spanish Florida, would follow up 10 years later, but neither France nor Spain established settlements. Instead, the British would come back in the summer of 1608 under the leadership of Captain John Smith, who explored the Chesapeake Bay at length in search of resources for the newly established colony of Virginia. What he found attracted the interest of Virginians, and in 1631 they established a fur trading post at Kent Island on the Chesapeake Bay under the leadership of William Claiborne, a wealthy merchant and planter. But they were not the only ones interested in the surrounding lands. George Calvert, the first Baron of Baltimore, wanted to create a colony that would be safe for Catholics in the New World. He had attempted to do so in the early 1620s in Newfoundland, but it failed, given the harsh weather conditions, so he petitioned a charter from King Charles for land further south. The Crown was receptive to this idea, given that the Dutch had established a colony along the Delaware, and were afraid they might encroach at some point on their colony in Virginia. Thus, when Calvert died in April 1632, a charter was granted to his son, Cecilius, that established a new colony north of the Potomac with the name of Terra Maria, or Maryland, in Latin, in honor of the king's wife, Queen Henrietta Maria. Slightly over a year later, the first British settlers set sail for the new colony, landing at St. Clement's Island in the lower Potomac on March 25, 1634. Famously, this was the site of the first Catholic Mass in the 13 British colonies, an event now commemorated with a giant cross in a preserved state park. Led by Leonard Calvert, Cecilius' younger brother, the new settlers bought land from the Yaucomico Indians and established St. Mary's, the colony's first settlement. The charter had granted the Lord Baltimore a proprietorship that was almost absolute, and Calvert tried to rule that way, but soon met stiff resistance. This led first to the creation of a colonial assembly in 1635, and then to a reshuffling of prerogatives, where the assembly gained the power to initiate legislation in 1638. The colony had fertile lands that could be used to grow tobacco. This led to a steady growth in population, although the harsh conditions and local diseases limited its explosiveness and also made the importation of enslaved Africans an attractive commercial decision. The first such documented arrival occurred in St. Mary's in 1642. They also were not the sole newcomers. Although the Calvert family had originally envisioned the colony as a haven for Catholics, others soon became interested in the area, so that within a few years they were outnumbered by Anglicans and Puritans. A group of the latter opted to leave Virginia in 1649 when the colony made Anglicanism the official religion and settled on the north shore of the Severn River. They called their new community Providence, a name that would be changed in 1698 to Annapolis. Partly as a result of the new arrivals, the Maryland legislature passed the Toleration Act of 1649, one of the earliest American laws guaranteeing the freedom of religion, although in this case it was limited to Christians. Not that this prevented religious conflict. There had already been a rebellion in 1644 that stemmed mostly from competing claims over Kent Island, the post on the Chesapeake that the Virginian William Claiborne had established in 1631, and which Leonard Calvert had seized by force in 1638. But in 1650, a much bigger one arose. this time from the newly arrived Puritans, in large part because it dovetailed with religious conflicts back home related to the English Civil War of 1642-1651, between those who supported King Charles and those who sided with the Puritan-led English Parliament. Leonard Calvert had died in 1647, so his replacement, William Stone, was named new governor and in 1649 set out to put down the rebellion. At first, the Puritans were successful in beating back Stone's forces at the Battle of the Severn in 1655, but the Calvert family would eventually regain control and the revolt would end in 1659. This did not end the challenges to authority in Maryland, however. When the Glorious Revolution occurred in 1688, which restored a Protestant monarch to the British throne, there was a massive Puritan revolt that marched on St. Mary's, the capital. The rebels stripped Lord Baltimore of his right to govern, and political power was transferred to the Crown, which would rule the colony directly as royal province until 1715. During this period, Catholics were persecuted, and all original Catholic churches in southern Maryland burned down. The capital was also moved to Annapolis in 1698, a town that was renamed in honor of Princess Anne, who would later become queen. By the end of the 17th century, Maryland was a well-established enterprise with a total population of about 30,000, with counties that encompassed the entirety of the Chesapeake Bay. An increase in tobacco prices sustained the colony's prosperity, and in 1715, political changes in England and the conversion to Anglicanism over the 4th Lord of Baltimore, Benedict Calvert, paved the way for the full return of his family's rights over Maryland. This obviously did not end the independence streak that had developed in the colony, something which before the end of the century would become a serious problem. But that was still in the future. In the meantime, Maryland continued to develop. In 1729, the colony's assembly chartered Baltimore town out of a number of previous settlements. Soon after, it also created a company to mine iron ore deposits in its vicinity, which helped Baltimore grow. By 1788, it had around 14,000 people. Likewise, after buying land from the native tribes, it opened up the western part of the state to development. Initial outlines of what would later become Hagerstown, Frederick, and Gaithersburg were settled in 1739, 1745, and 1765 respectively. Hagerstown and Gaithersburg were named after people that actually lived there. Who Frederick is named after, on the other hand, is unclear, but it's probably Frederick Calvert, the 6th Baron of Baltimore. This growth, however, was not without conflict. There were competing claims in the Panhandle part of the future state with the French, but also with Virginia and Pennsylvania, and in the northern part with Pennsylvania because the original royal charters that established the line between the two colonies had been based on faulty maps. The disputed border even led to violence with the outbreak of the so-called Cresap's War in 1732, where the militias of both colonies intervened. King George then had to intercede to end the hostilities, and later in 1760 forced the Penns and Calverts to agree to make a boundary. This led to the hiring of Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon, who set out to survey the border between 1763 and 1767 and finally established the Mason-Dixon line in 1768. The claims on the western part would not be resolved until 1781, when Congress allowed Maryland to keep its panhandle so that it could have access to farmland in the Mississippi River system in exchange for it ratifying the Articles of Confederation. Soon other problems surfaced. Britain had been in conflict with France over control of North America for over a century at that point, and been engaged with them in several wars, including what is known in the US as the French and Indian War in 1763. This had been a costly endeavor, and the British Parliament attempted to get the 13 colonies to pay for what they saw as the cost of their security. The Colonial saw it differently, refused to pay their taxes, and the escalating conflict eventually led to the American Revolution. Maryland shared in some of those grievances. In May and October 1774, Maryland had its own tea parties at Chestertown and Annapolis. In the latter, the owner of the ship was forced to burn his own vessel and the pound of tea he was carrying. When war finally broke out in 1776, Maryland was somewhat divided over the issue. Although the state had some radical voices like Charles Carroll, a wealthy planter, the longest survivor and the only Catholic to sign the Declaration of Independence, as well as Samuel Chase, another signer and revolutionary firebrand, its continental representation was more moderate, and there were areas that had disproportionate loyalist support, like the Eastern Shore. Although no major battles took place in Maryland, the future state provided 11 distinct militias to the cause, some of whom were critical to the effort. None more so than the Maryland 400 from the 1st Maryland Regiment, who were key in the Battle of Long Island, earning George Washington's praise. The future state also had one of the most symbolic events of the war. The Continental Congress met in Annapolis, where it accepted George Washington's resignation as General of the Army and ratified the treaty that recognized the colonies as independent, the Treaty of Paris. American victory brought the definitive end to the Calvert's family control of Maryland, but the Articles of Confederation arrangement brought other problems. For one, there was trade and navigation. In March 1785, Maryland and Virginia met to deal with this and established the first interstate compact. This was followed up in September 1786 by 5 other states, although not Maryland, who met in Annapolis to try to hammer out broader agreements on trade. They were unsuccessful but realized that a much larger convention was needed, a recognition that led directly to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia under a year later. Maryland sent 5 delegates, 2 of whom, Luther Martin and John Francis Mercer, opted to leave because they disagreed with the proceedings. Martin in particular demanded a Bill of Rights, which would later be added to the Constitution. Maryland would then become the 7th state to ratify the new compact on April 28, 1788. The Constitution also led to the creation of the District of Columbia, whose land was ceded by Maryland and Virginia in 1790. The early days of the Republic were generally prosperous for Maryland. Given its location and its status as a deep water port, Baltimore became the 3rd largest city in the country. It helped that the state saw major infrastructure developments during this period, including the national road connecting Cumberland to the Ohio River and further points west, built between 1811 and 1837, the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal constructed in 1828, and the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the first charter railway in the U.S., laid out in 1830. There would also be a number of important universities that were founded during this period, including St. Mary's College in 1840, the United States Naval Academy in 1845, and the University of Maryland in 1856. Even the War of 1812, a conflict that began over trade tensions between Britain and the United States, did not stop this upward trend, despite the fact that in 1814, the British invaded Maryland, bringing destruction with them. Their most famous attack, the siege of Fort McHenry on the outskirts of Baltimore on September 12th, inspired Francis Scott Key to write a poem which would later be the lyrics of the national anthem. The country's much bigger national problem, slavery, was also a big issue in Maryland. Tobacco's prosperity had been underpinned from the beginning by kidnapped Africans, so that by 1860, 12.7% of the state's population was enslaved. However, it also had a high rate of manumission, making Maryland the state with the highest number of free blacks in the country by far, with around 25,000 more than Virginia, the next closest. 3 of its most famous, Frances Ellen Watkins Parker, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Tubman, became prominent in the abolitionist cause. Parker and Douglass as writers and orators, and the latter in a more hands-on way when she personally went back to help others escape slavery through the Underground Railroad. As tensions over the issue grew, the southern part bordering Virginia and the eastern shore were generally more sympathetic to the southern cause, while the central and western sections tended to agree with the north. Thus, the state would end up having men fight on both sides of the conflict. When the attack on Fort Sumter finally came and the war began, the first civilian bloodshed took place on Maryland soil a few days later. This was because, as the Massachusetts militia made its way down to protect D.C., they stopped in Baltimore to change trains, and soon had a riot broke out when a mob sympathetic to the Confederacy blocked the route and attacked the train. In the confusion, the soldiers retaliated, and soon 12 civilians and 5 troops lay dead. Hundreds more were wounded. This was only the beginning. As a border state, Maryland would see multiple important battles, but none more so than Antietam on September 17, 1862, the deadliest one-day battle in American history, with nearly 23,000 dead. This was key because it not only stopped the Confederate invasion, but also gave Lincoln the political room he needed to proclaim the Emancipation Proclamation and probably stop Britain and France from recognizing the Confederacy. The war would eventually end with some 2,500 Maryland troops dead and a Union victory. The racial tensions underlying the war would not be so easily resolved in the state, however. Maryland had passed a new constitution in 1864 that abolished slavery and created some protections for African Americans. White Democrats were able to regain power after the end of the conflict and established a new constitution in 1867, which is still in use today, although it has been heavily amended over the years. It had one key provision meant to help the white elite, which would later become a big impediment for their plans, however. The provision was the reapportionment of the legislature based on population, not counties. For roughly the following 50 years, the white elite would try to pass laws to disenfranchise blacks, but African Americans in the state, especially in Baltimore, gave them enough power to block their efforts. This did not translate to elected positions, however. There would be no black U.S. representatives of any type, or even mayors of Annapolis or Baltimore, until after the Civil Rights era. In fact, because the right of blacks to vote was the only real issue to distinguish the parties, party machines became the norm, creating clientelistic connections with people like Arthur Pugh Gorman of rural Howard County and I. Freeman Raisin, the boss of Baltimore City, in charge. This in turn led to progressive blowback and muckraking journalism that tried to undermine the machines. The most famous journalist of the era, however, was H.L. Mencken, the editor of the Baltimore Sun, who was more of a reluctant muckraker, but no less a fearsome social critic. Eventually, the machines gave way to Albert Ritchie, a Democrat who was the most popular and longest-serving governor in state's history, and who also did much to professionalize and streamline state government, leaving an imprint that lasted far after his death. Meanwhile, as the state's post-war economy continued to grow, philanthropy became a major source of improvement for the state during this period. Johns Hopkins, Enoch Pratt, George Peabody, and Henry Walters set the financial basis for a university, free library, art school, and museum, among other institutions. The Great Depression hit the state hard, and although Maryland did not receive as much government spending per capita as other states, it would change the significance of the federal government in the state. In fact, what truly placed Maryland in its current trajectory was World War II, as the importance of Washington, D.C. also increased the states as a simple function of proximity. The global conflict produced unprecedented national demands in military preparations and industrial production. Maryland would become a center for both. Armed service bases were expanded or constructed anew, including Andrews Air Force Base, Fort George Meade, and Patuxent Naval Air Station, as well as hospitals such as the Bethesda Naval Medical Center, or as it's better known, Walter Reed. It also made previously built sites like Camp David much more important as the significance of the United States in the world also increased. The end of the war brought with it a baby and economic boom as suburbanization accelerated in the state with a vengeance. The governor at the time, William Preston Lane Jr., took that prosperity and gave the government a more activist role than it had in the past, with a massive increase in spending on public education and the building of a bridge across the Chesapeake that opened to the public in 1952. Meanwhile, racial tensions returned in the 1960s as the civil rights movement developed nationwide. One of its most notable examples in Maryland was the Cambridge Movement, a series of protests centered around Dorchester County in the Eastern Shore. Led by Gloria Richardson, it picketed against businesses that refused to hire black people, organized sit-ins, and fought any way it could against discrimination. Protests would sometimes turn violent, which eventually led J. Miller Tawes, the governor, to declare martial law in 1963 and send the National Guard. Robert Kennedy then intervened to get both sides to come to an agreement in what became known as the Treaty of Cambridge. Of course, that the civil rights movement began at all happened in part as a result of the Supreme Court decisions of the 1950s, like Brown v. Board of Topeka, which themselves were argued by Maryland's most famous legal mind, Thurgood Marshall. The Baltimore-born lawyer would continue to significantly shape the country's legal structure when he was appointed Supreme Court Justice on August 30, 1967. Despite overall prosperity and political gains for African Americans, Baltimore continued to be Maryland's biggest exception as white flight and urban decay took its toll. Although there was a major effort to revitalize the Inner Harbor starting in the late 1970s with the opening of the Baltimore Aquarium and Harbor Place in 1980 and the Camden Yards in 1992, a number of the city's neighborhoods continued to be stricken by poverty and crime. This combination, plus the city's politics, made for a vicious cycle of underinvestment and over-policing. Most famously captured by the HBO series The Wire, this pattern led to much frustration with the police, which would occasionally lead to violent protests. The most recent one was in 2015, when prosecutors concluded that police officers had been responsible for the death of Freddie Gray, a black man who had been originally arrested for carrying a knife. As Maryland continues to benefit from its proximity to Washington, D.C., enjoying the highest median household income in the country since 2010, challenges remain. This is not just in Baltimore, but also in counties like Allegheny and Dorchester, whose median income is lower than even West Virginia, the poorest state in the Union. Whether the new economic trends will be enough to revitalize those areas remains to be seen.